Season 2 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Carl Haley and Daniel Murphy. I have many questions to ask you, but the most pressing of them by far seems to be, because I've heard so many arguments, so many disputes, so many opinions differ, is the word monologist or monologist? How do you pronounce that?
Well, I don't know that there's an arbiter, like I guess the big monologuist in the sky. Although, from my reading, God was actually a dialogist, and I'm actually basing my next piece is kind of based on reading Exodus, and there are all these conversations that God has with, Moses usually. A lot of times God is doing the yelling, stuff like that. So I don't know, maybe there's an Aramaic word that really would be the best to use. I go with monologist but I feel because I'm sort of like a big guy, it's like a logger,
a monologuer.
Right, whereas a monologuer or monologist, whereas monologist sounds, I don't know, vaguely striving for a certain artiste kind of quality to it. But it's the one I hear the most. But I mean, just the fact that, people would even know that it's a genre is really cool, however they pronounce it.
Right, they can say whatever they want.
Yeah.
It's Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall, speaking with monologist.
Yeah.
Monologist, I got it? Josh Kornbluth, who is not just that, by the way. You might know him, you might even know his work and not think of him that way. You might know him from the productions of his monologues. You might know him from the film of Haiku Tunnel, one of them. You might know him from television's Josh Kornbluth show. You might know him from... Well, you probably know him from the monologues themselves. I don't think it's no longer an obscure pursuit being a monologist. You might know him from Red Diaper Baby or The Mathematics of Change or Ben Franklin Unplugged. There are many of them. There are more on the way. But as I said, we're sitting here in San Francisco. I don't know if I mentioned we were in San Francisco, but we are in the Contemporary Jewish Museum in downtown San Francisco. And you mentioned off mic just before you've recently gotten into looking into Jewish ideas, Jewish things. What happened? I mean, we mentioned religion already, but specifically Judaism.
Yeah. Well, it's actually really appropriate. Of course, the listener doesn't have the visuals here, but it could have been at this table, but it was at a table in this cafe at the Contemporary Jewish Museum that I got pulled in to, sort of. I think of it sort of like in Al Pacino's relationship to the mob, where he gets pulled in and then he can't. I mean, in his case, I guess in my case it was familial too. But what happened was that I was here just a few years ago when this lovely museum opened. I came here on Target Family Night or Target Family Day with my wife and son. My wife and I have a friend who was working here at the time, and we were interested in seeing the museum, but it was free. And so I was sitting here, and of course, what you do as a Jew, generally speaking, at any museum, is you go right to the cafe. That's really the main point of a museum.
I didn't know that.
No, well,
the secret's out.
Yeah, well, we try to keep this stuff close to the vest. And so I was sitting down here, and this guy named Dan Schifrin came up to me, and I'd run into Dan at various events. He's a wonderful writer, and he also hosted some panel that I was on, speaking about stuff, and he works here. He's a writer in residence and does other things as well. And just sort of by coincidence, he was on that day trying to figure out how he was going to book an event. They wanted to do some sort of live event that was connected with an exhibit they were going to be having in a few months from then, which was these 10 portraits by Andy Warhol of famous 20th century Jews. And they actually grant money to pay someone to do something. And Dan, who's very sort of very creative thinker, tries to do unusual things rather than, or in addition to the usual sort of docent kind of thing where people, things that you would do with an exhibit. He thought it would. When he saw me, he had the idea maybe it would be cool for me to give a talk about my reaction.
He's a monologist.
Yes, yeah, right. And I told him, quite honestly, I didn't know anything about Warhol and maybe arguably less about Jewish stuff, even though I'm Jewish. And he said, perfect. And because the idea was really for him was that in a way I'd be like the museum goer who walks in, sees an exhibit, and then tries his best to connect with it. And so I ended up doing a series of those talks, which went really well here at the Contemporary Jewish Museum, which I titled, which was Dan's idea for the title, Andy Warhol, Good for the Jews? ? And
how much of a pre-existing question was that, or were you the first to ask it?
Well, it depends. The whole question, in asking whether Andy Warhol is good for the Jews, I'm pretty sure we were the first to ask. The question of is it good for the Jews is a much older question. It's one that it's funny because like a lot of Jewish things, it's fraught with irony and tragedy. The question, is it good for the Jews, would be the older Jews would ask, those who are now, let's say, hopefully still alive in their 80s and 90s. They would, or even older, actually. But that generation, the question is this. The joke about it is that you ask it about anything. So, like, not just like something that's really pressing, like, is the new czar in Russia good for the Jews or something like that. But you ask it about, when I say in the piece, you ask about, like, the lint filter in the dryer. Is it good for the joke about it is that it becomes this thing that almost totemically that especially older Jews, or they were older by the time I was growing up, would ask, is it good for the Jews? Just about anything. But so the joke about it is that, they ask it about all these inappropriate things that really don't have anything to do with whether being good for the Jews or bad for the Jews. But then the serious part behind it is that it, of course, comes from a cultural experience of a lot of things going wrong for Jews, really bad, things going really badly, and
you're right to ask.
Yeah, and so it's not silly to be paranoid at some point, and so I did I think I had 5 or so performances, which are sold out here, of my talk, Andy Warhol, Good for the Jews. I collaborated with my theater director, David Dower, and this guy, Alex Nichols, he did all this great visual stuff, slides and projections, and Marco D'Ambrosio, who's a composer I work with. And I did this it was about an hour-long presentation. And then after that, I worked with all those people to develop it into a full-length monologue, also called Andy Warhol, Good for the Jews, which I have been touring with. So what happened was that when I had that commission, that I suddenly had to learn, like, do a crash course in Warhol, in really art. I didn't really know visual art very much, but especially Warhol, and then in Jewish things. And so I went to a rabbi whom I had met very briefly, who's in the rabbi of a synagogue in my neighborhood where I live in Berkeley, whose name is somewhat unfortunate name, but actual name is Menachem Creditor, and just
leave that there.
Yeah. I joke about it in the piece after asking if it was okay with him, if it was okay with him. But he's this wonderful guy, and also, as it turns out, Dan Schifrin goes to that synagogue or shul as well, and so. And the rabbi suggested reading, and I talked with other people, and I just got really, really interested. And I'm still interested. I'm working on this new piece called Sea of Reeds that I'm working on it's a commission for next summer. That, as I mentioned, it sort of seeks to combine the Exodus story with talking about playing the oboe, which I also do.
It brings back a flood of memories from learning the oboe, as I've read.
And there are all these. I mean, you can probably make connections about anything to anything, but I mean, the whole idea of first of all, that there was the Sea of Reeds, which was apparently, or at least good chance that was the original name for the Red Sea, was the Reed Sea. But also that the oboe itself is such a neurotic instrument.
First time I've heard that said about it.
Really?
Yeah. Well, I don't hear much about the oboe.
Do you know any oboists?
I don't know. I guess I've met you.
Right. But if you did, I mean, honestly, Colin, if you ever will meet, if you ever do meet, you will very quickly get a sense of that you are dealing with a troubled person. Even if, not only is the instrument very difficult to play, but the reeds themselves you have to make for yourself, and they're very fragile, and they don't last.
Why can't you buy them?
Because it's incredibly personal. It's a double reed. It vibrates against itself. It's actually from one piece of sort of bamboo, this special kind of bamboo, but it is so specific to the player, to the instrument, and even to the weather, to the environment, to the altitude. So it's just incredibly picky, and then it doesn't last very long. It just simply loses its qualities quickly, and a lot of that impermanence, a lot of that being bound together, being different parts that are bound together, vibrating. I mean, all this I find very evocative, and I'm excited about exploring it. So, but that first show, Andy Warhol, who was himself, as I learned, a very observant Catholic, went to church every Sunday his whole life, as far as I know, and whom I came to see as a very spiritual artist himself. But Warhol, who had done these portraits, I didn't actually like, still don't like that much of, but of these 10 wonderful Jewish geniuses, as he called them, from the 20th century. But the fact that through Dan Schifrin and the Contemporary Jewish Museum that I was brought into contact with Jewish stuff through these portraits by this Catholic guy, I find really intriguing. I would sometimes call myself a Warhol Jew, you know. And so that really got me going. And one of the things that I really found and find so fascinating, just for me personally, resonant about studying Judaism, because I'm still not, I don't believe in any sort of supernatural God. I just don't have, I mean, I could be wrong. I just don't have any experience of such a thing.
Right.
But I find that I was raised, as you may know, as I talk about in Red Diaper Baby, communist, by these communist Jewish parents. And what I discovered and am discovering is that a lot of what I took to be their communism was also their Jewishness, that a lot of the preoccupations were with justice. I mean, just in very broad terms, with seeking justice. There's a messianic quality both to the religion and, well, to both religions. I sort of think of the communism as kind of a religion or a faith.
Yeah, it seems to demand, especially in the way you talk about in Red Diaper Baby, it's you have to have faith that the utopia is coming. It'll be here one day.
And you absolutely must in order to follow that faith in that way. And it's a beautiful feeling. And that's something else that I'm also dealing with too, is that I wasn't raised at all religious, but I actually feel a kinship with people who are very orthodox in their religion, of whatever religion, because I feel that I was raised as sort of an orthodox communist, and it was certainly an orthodoxy. And so when inconvenient facts would come to light, let's say about Stalin or the Soviet Union, I mean, that's worse than inconvenient, but when it doesn't fit with the narrative of the orthodoxy would have ways of blocking it out, of sort of asserting the priority of the orthodoxy over any facts that other people might uncover. And I know that comes from a deep longing for meaning in one's life and for beauty and order. And so I relate to it. So I've been finding the whole thing it's a wonderful new topic for me. And in a way it's new and it's old, in that I was, raised culturally Jewish, but not at all religiously Jewish. And so in a way it's also like being a Red Diaper Baby, being the son of communists. That's sort of like, I got that from my parents by definition. The Jewish stuff I sort of did, but in the fact that I'm studying it now and trying to apply it in my stories, that I feel it's maybe I've made it sort of my own sort of thing, It's a coming of middle age sort of thing.
Writing, I mean, since writing Red Diaper Baby, and since that work has had a life of its own, I mean, have you had moments where you think, oh boy, I miss having communism around, where, you describe yourself as being, I don't know, you can tell me, I mean, your parents were fairly fervent, and you yourself, you write as at least saying fervent statements about communism. And when did you put that behind you? And were there moments when it was like, man, that was kind of nice to have that there?
Yeah. It's really, I mean, it's complicated. I mean, and I feel, and I've heard from other people. I remember hearing an interview with Stephen Colbert, who I believe is Catholic, and certainly was raised Catholic, where I just got a sense, I don't know him at all, I just don't fan him through interviews, but I got a sense that he is able to joke hilariously about not only Catholicism, but other faiths as well. And yet I get a sense from him that he still has a lot of faith, that it has evolved perhaps. And I sort of somewhat feel the same way. Like, to me, communism itself, as I've seen now, was one variant of what many people were getting into in the 19th century. And specifically speaking about Jews, that there were a lot of problems, there were a lot of challenges. And then at some point it seemed like assimilation would be possible. And then there were certain things that would happen repeatedly that made it seem that assimilation might not be possible, or might be more difficult. And so there were all these different related movements, Zionism, communism, socialism, and variants of those. But they all, to me, in some way, they had a very beautiful idea behind them that motivated them. As I say, sort of an idea for meaning, can I live a life that has a meaning? How do I live my life better rather than worse? What rules do I go by? And so for me, the communism that my parents transmitted, especially my father, was very, as I look back on it, very idiosyncratic to them in some ways. Like, they quoted Marx and Engels and Lenin even and stuff like that. But it really was, for me, that in a way it was like when you ask me about my communism, part of it is just connected to that I love my parents and that they were really lovely people. And part of their loveliness and their joy and creativity, they happen to express through this culture. I mean, when my parents were growing up in New York City, it was a very relatively popular thing to be in the Young Communist League. It was sort of like being in the Boy or Girl Scouts.
A social club almost.
Yeah, absolutely. For my father, my mother's parents were also very progressive, but my father's parents were conservative, and it was a way for him to delineate himself from them and to find free. He saw a guy on a soapbox talking about Marx, literally in the Bronx.
Doesn't get purer than that.
No, and so, and of course, and then my parents were born in the 1920s, and so there were all these things going on in the world and in this country that made it seem very promising and that looked very promising for socialists, for communists. Unfortunately, since then, we've seen that, the places that have called themselves communists or even socialists for the most part, well, especially communists, have in fact been evil, paternalistic, and worse societies that have, killed millions of people and ruined lives. And my discovery of that exists, and that wasn't just made up by the corporate-owned media. It came in my 20s. I mean, I grew up in this bubble, right? So, and so what happened is that I found out, oh my God, these terrible things happen, and so then I had to think, well, what am I and what do I believe? And that's still evolving. I mean, sometimes I even shudder. The most terrible thing you could be in my family was the L word was a liberal. It's sort of as bad for them as it is for, super right wingers. But I might be a liberal. I think of myself as being progressive. And I'm very proud of the progressive tradition and the progressive part of what my parents raised me in, which is a lot of it, the labor movement, the civil rights movement. Really, my father's best friend was a Presbyterian minister who's also a Marxist. And really, to me, it comes down to a couple of things. The last shall be first. And to treat your neighbor as you would like to be treated. And those political ideas and movements that follow those principles and spiritual movements that follow those principles, I find very compelling. So really that's the opposite of a short answer or whatever. But so in a way, though I am not, I certainly wouldn't say that I am now a communist, unless it was Joe McCarthy asking me, in which case I would do it out of spite. But for me, just personally, because of my upbringing, I release one of those things that you release that are really when you feel good, when you're happy, whatever those things are. Pheromone? No.
Endorphins?
Endorphins, that's it. So to me, and for very few other people, probably in the world, when I hear or think of the word communist, I release endorphins. I actually associate it with love and warmth, even though I acknowledge all the horrible things that were done in the name of it by terrible people.
It's a fascinating phenomenon in both the religion and political beliefs like communism. It goes well beyond, but in the failed or flawed instantiations of it, when critics can point to, well, you're a communist. Well, look at the Soviet Union. Look at most instances of communism being tried, or if people who are anti-religion will say, well, what about scandal X, Y, and Z, and whatever religion you happen to be in? What about these religious wars? There's that mechanism where someone who is an adherent can always say, well, that's not the pure version of what I believe. And it seems like it's always a cop-out you can go to, but they're also correct. That in fact is not the pure version of what they believe. But is there? I mean, it seems like an eternal condition that it must always be thus, right?
And that what you just said is, to me, as I'm understanding it, a very Jewish formulation, by the way.
Really?
It's that. I mean, to me, really sort of the really typical Jewish formulations are paradoxical. So on the one hand, yes, it can be and often is a cop-out. And on the other hand, it is and can be true. And both are at the same time. Both are happening at the same time. I think my previous piece to the Andy Warhol piece is called Citizen Josh. And it also doubled as my attempted senior thesis for Princeton several, decades late. And it was about democracy. It addressed, in a way, a similar question, which is that take democracy, it is formed through human energy, like really genuine human energy, and is remarkable. But once a democracy, in the rare cases where democracy wins, where it wins a revolution, then what? Well, then you have institutions. You have to have institutions, as far as I know, in order to have a continuing, maintainable polity. And so once you do that, you immediately start the process of tamping down at least a lot of that spontaneity, a lot of that energy. You just do. And so, similarly, you have, when the little that I've read about early Christianity, for example, but it was very communist from what I've read, and very Jewish, of course, but it was, that was an example of the spark of it. The idea of it was really beautiful, and it had to do with, to me, very progressive, and had to do with justice, and was very revolutionary in a lot of ways. And not to say that there aren't still revolutionary aspects of all of Christianity today, but what happens naturally is then there are churches, and there are various denominations, and power comes into play, and emperors get involved, and so it seems to be a human struggle. It seems to be a human struggle between this beautiful spontaneity that we have, and this really, considering what I think to be a completely amoral universe, this remarkable push, sporadic as it is, towards love. There is with that, it seems equally naturally, there are all these reactions to quash it, to temper it, and it just seems to be the way we are.
It seems to me that I'm thinking through your monologues, a lot of them, most of them perhaps, they deal with this notion of what beautiful abstractions become when they enter life, or specifically yours often, but it's the beauty of abstract mathematics, right, or democracy, yeah. Or I'm having a hard time putting this idea into Haiku Tunnel, but maybe the idea of a system, it's the idea of who your responsibility is actually to. Have you thought about that as a through line in your work, or is it something that's more for outsiders to observe?
I haven't till now. It's interesting. So I'm sort of pondering it now that you've said it. And yes, Haiku Tunnel in a lot of ways, by the way, is kind of an anomalous piece for me. And I intended it as such, by the way. It was my second piece that I ever did. And my first piece had been about my parents and their communist friends. And I thought, well, I just wondered, can I tell any other kind of story? Because I've told that one. Can I tell a story that essentially in sort of I'm not making any bold claims for suspense or anything, but in Hitchcockian terms has a MacGuffin, and so in a way that was the one piece that I constructed just with a particular purpose in mind, which was to be different.
And making the exception to your own career, almost.
But there is still, even for me, and Haiku Tunnel for people listening, there's many people who haven't seen it or read it or heard it, but it's about me. I play a character who is a wonderful temporary worker. And then once he goes permanent, in this case as a legal secretary, horrible things happen. I think if I were to sort of connect it to what you were saying, still to me, in a way, the analogy is this, that it's the temp world. That's the world of spontaneity. It's the world of of what you're talking, the beautiful abstraction, or the beautiful possibilities, the world in which possibilities are great, but responsibilities are perhaps fewer. And that's the temp world, and then the perm world to my character in that piece. And in the movie is a world in which just seems to be filled with responsibility, with onerous duties and connections and being chained down, and none of the lightness of the temporary world. And he certainly doesn't resolve it in that story.
We're probably not sitting far from where all this drama went down, are we? Downtown San Francisco. I mean, yeah. I'm not the most familiar person in the world with this city, but that's why I'm taking this show here for this week. But we'll get to San Francisco. But I wonder, with Haiku Tunnel, you made the exception to your career at that point, and it seemed like that you kind of inadvertently caught the zeitgeist of office dissatisfaction that was so prevalent in the 90s. I mean, did you see that as having done that?
I sort of felt it at the time. Like what is it? My brother Jake, who co-directed that film with me, co-wrote it with me. But he says that we were calling, I don't remember this, but we were calling it the FUBU for office workers. And the FUBU, I don't even know if it's still around, but FUBU is like for us, by us, right? It's, and so that the idea that, and it was to me also, again, a very sort of, if not communist, fringy idea. This idea that here are people who are not glorified, and I'm one of them, and in a way, just to tell a story from the perspective of one of them is in itself kind of ballsy, I was trying to think of a fancier word, but
that'll do.
Yeah, and so that was sort of in our mind. I didn't really have a sense of what, how it would fit in culturally or what that time was as compared to any other times. But it also just happened to be this experience that I'd had. I find my brother and I both have been inspired and, aspire. I mean, we worship sort of the British filmmaker and playwright Mike Leigh, whose work over and over focuses on people like that, people who it's his stuff is not almost never about like kings and queens, and once it's about Gilbert and Sullivan, which is actually a great movie, but even it's about all these people just out in the world who don't have power, don't have money,
stays close to the ground.
Yeah, but really when I did Haiku Tunnel, when I first performed it, I was still working at that job, and it was, as I said, I want to do something different from what I'd done before, of telling sort of my coming-of-age story with Red Diaper Baby, or what became Red Diaper Baby. It just struck me as it would be a cool thing to try to do, to tell a story in which the tension, so to speak, had to do with a guy not mailing a certain number of letters. Like to take something really prosaic and commonplace and, seemingly unimportant, but make it really important for that guy.
Tension is tension, after all. Even if the object is mailing a letter, it could be the fate of the world could be in play as well. I mean, it's all scale, right? I mean, you establish the scale on something like Haiku Tunnel, and it's more tension than, say, a movie like Armageddon. The first thing where the fate of the world is in the balance. Do you know what I mean?
I do know what you mean. Although interestingly, one of the things I found. I played around with, when we were making the movie version of Haiku Tunnel, I played around with making, this guy, Josh, like me, his boss is a tax lawyer, and I played around with the idea that the thing that Josh doesn't mail out, my character doesn't mail out, the letter, very important letter he doesn't mail out, is really important, like in the world, like it's going to result in, if not Armageddon, that, something falling down or big company falling apart. And I played with that, and I ended up not doing that because it actually ended up being important, I felt, for that story. It ended up being important that it be only important to him, that we just don't know. And I might have been somewhat influenced from my youthful reading of the Truffaut Hitchcock interviews, where like Hitchcock went into such great length about how important it was, like how he had learned through successive drafts. And I'm paraphrasing from my memory from when I was a teenager, but Hitchcock would talk about that the MacGuffin, that the thing that the hero was supposedly trying to do, that it not be specified, that the more specific you got, the more real it became, the less effective it became. So that, there's like a formula, like in The Lady Vanishes. I mean, there's a formula. It's important in World War II and stuff like that. But the details of the formula are not only not important, but it's important not to know them for the story to work.
It makes sense. I mean, it holds up to every example that I can quickly bring to mind. And it seems like, making a show, making a monologue, you're taking materials from your life. Some of them you have to make vaguer, not because you're trying to protect the innocent or what have you, sometimes, sure, but also because you're trying to universalize them? Or is this one of those things where more details universalize paradoxically?
Yeah.
How do you, I mean, I guess it's both. Maybe it's that paradox.
In this case, I'm going to go with the latter of what you said. I just sort of feel I certainly just, all I could say is I never consciously universalize what I do, that I really try to tell my story as specifically as possible, simply because those tend to yield the details that people grab at, that are interesting to people. It tends to lead to the jokes that are funny to people. Even by the fact that if they are funny jokes to people, that does mean that they are universal in some way, since these other people relate to it. But that just happens to be how I feel it. The way I feel it is that I'm really, really, really talking about my specific experience. I'm not trying to be representative, consciously at least.
You mentioned earlier this assumption that you've come upon that perhaps everything is connected to everything. That seems like an assumption one needs to make to be an effective monologist. No, I mean, for a work like a monologue, everybody, I mean, and there's maybe 8 big living names right now that people generally know, even if they're not into monologues. In all their work and yours, there is that sense that they're premised upon the idea that everything can be connected to everything.
Yeah. I agree. I mean, I think certainly with monologues that are based on autobiographically based monologues, I mean, there's some of the great monologists like Lily Tomlin, Eric Bogosian, Danny Hock. For the most part, when I've seen them, their shows have, and I mean, actually, Lily Tomlin's, which is maybe her show, the Search for Intelligent Life in the Universe, is one of the greatest things I've ever seen. It in fact is about how everything's connected. Now that I think of it, but in a way, I just don't. It's a mystery to me how people like Danny Hock and Eric Bogosian do their thing, because I don't impersonate they can become other people, and then they can do like a series of vignettes as other people, and so those might be connected in a certain way. But in what you're talking about, I certainly related to those of us who sort of speak as ourselves. Like here I am on stage. I'm going to tell you about my life, and connecting is a lot of it. It's a lot of the. It's a lot of the fabric. You try to. It's such a ridiculous thing to do, to get up on stage and talk about yourself. I mean, it really is, and you know it if you're doing it. I mean, you know it going into it. I mean, it is so presumptuous, as opposed to if Barack Obama were to talk about himself, that would not be presumptuous, right?
I guess he did get elected, so that gives you a mandate to talk about yourself.
Yes, but also, yeah, I mean, that's a remarkable life. Okay, if Susan Sontag had done a one-woman show about herself, no one would have questioned, well, geez, are you a substantial? But for those of us who basically, not because we've done anything, but just decide that we want to do this or feel an affinity for doing this, there's sort of this question, like, why? Like, why would you do it? And I think the only possible answer is because, well, it's only is meaningful. It's only excusable if the audience is finding meaning and entertainment in it, and narrative connecting. When you have a life, when you're talking about your own life, maybe you're talking about other things, but my only experience is basing stuff on my own life. Making connections is the natural way to try to weave some sort of a rhythm and order, a sense of when you feel and the audience feels, oh, that came back and that came back again, and that's related to that. It relaxes them. It gives them a sense, if it's done well, of progress, that, they're not just going to be stuck with this endless,
Oh, he isn't just talking about himself. Oh, he isn't just saying what happened to him. I see now. You've got to reveal.
In a way, it's really what it is assuring them on some level, even if it's unconscious, that there is a great deal of artifice.
Right. I put the hours in, guys. Don't worry.
Right.
Don't say that, but you say it by. I mean, how? I don't want to reveal any of the tricks here of the monologist, but there's a great sense in which you have to reveal all that in ways that are as implicit as possible.
Well, say more about that.
As in, you're definitely not saying, you don't get up and say, okay, don't worry, guys, I worked on this. It's not just me talking about myself and then do it. But also, you make it very clear that that's the case in the work, embedded in the work.
I see what you're saying, making implicit the sort of reassurances and those things. No, absolutely. And a lot of it, I mean, I'm still on the learning curve, but I've been doing this for over 20 years now. And I've learned from my audiences and from my directors and collaborators and from other performers. And I mean, so much of that, a lot of it is performance craft. It's the way, and you don't realize that until you start doing it yourself. Like the way you carry yourself, the way you move, the way, just all these things that you do that are actually under your control, are reassuring. They show the audience that. They reassure the audience of that. And then there are aspects in the writing as well. I remember watching an interview with John Cleese, and he talked about. And again, I absorb these interviews and maybe I change them, but as I recall it, he talked about being shown a video, seeing himself for the first time on video walking and realizing and trying to, he's obviously famously did the Ministry of Silly Walks, but he saw himself trying to walk funny, but he realized when he saw it, he saw what other people saw. And he was then able to control it, shape it so that what he ended up perfecting and making brilliant was this combination of natural ways that he moves and can think of moving even to be funny, but then combine that with the craft, with the shaping so that he does it just so, right? And, because he's a great artist. And a lot of it is, for me as a performer and as a monologist it's so much about, the experience for me over these 20-some years has been so much about learning from audiences how I am received.
It's a certain self-awareness you develop. I think of the John Cleese story, and I think of you saying how, writing Ben Franklin Unplugged, you began thinking, that guy looks like an old version of me. Was that what you said?
Something like that.
And that's a form of self-awareness.
I'm not sure I even thought it was old. I thought it just looked like me. I was shaving one day and literally, and then I thought, wow, I sort of look like Ben Franklin.
That seems like a similar procedure. John Cleese sees himself on video. You see Ben Franklin in yourself, and that's using what you already happen to be, amplifying to an audience that.
It's complex. I have a compulsion and a joy in interacting with audiences. So that, as I mentioned earlier, I develop, and I'm not unique in this, but I develop all my stuff on stage in front of audiences. I develop it through improv, and then I refine it with my director till eventually it's word for word. But I don't type away from people. So at all times when I'm trying to generate material, I'm getting this feedback. And the way the feedback, and it's always surprising. And I learn all of these things about, these ideas that I have that I didn't even know I have. I say things on stage that I wouldn't say to friends or, I wouldn't think of, really. Because of just the way it fits for me. A friend of mine said that I treat an audience, at least at an improv, like an especially trusted therapist, But I hope that in their case that, at least that it's not just something for me, as therapy is supposed to be for the analysis end. But there's an interesting balance as well, because while I'm very responsive to the audience, I can't be guided by the audience. I can't be driven by the audience in a really important way or else I will tend to be safe. I'll tend to repeat myself and, take the audience, go to places I know that the audience will like because they've liked it before. And so a lot of times I've had to and try deliberately to talk about things that are difficult to talk about for me and in front of an audience as well. When I was working on my piece, Love and Taxes, I found it incredibly difficult. My director, David Dower, and I started working on that at the Sundance Theater Lab. And all I asked them for at the lab, it's just incredible. I don't know if you've been there. It's an incredible place, but I just asked for like the other actors and playwrights and whoever was at the lab that they would come in and be my audience, just a few of them at a time, so I could improvise to them. And one thing that I learned right away was that not just for me, but for people who came, because we spoke afterwards, we would have conversations, is that this particular subject, taxes and our personal finances, that a lot of this is sort of more taboo, more painful to talk about, more difficult to talk about than sex, for example. And that really also excited me, because I felt like, oh, here is something where I can try to explore this aspect of myself that I have trouble talking about and that other people have trouble talking about, and yet that we all want to talk about in a way, or that we want to see discussed in a way that we haven't seen discussed before. And so it's really, it's this whole process of learning from the audience, but also trying things, and the audience going, what the hell? And then, sometimes it stays that way, but sometimes you find something.
And what strikes me as unusual is that you've done so much. You've done so much of your career. You've built it here in the San Francisco Bay Area, where it's a place that does try to instantiate its own beautiful abstractions in society to varying degrees of success. But people love it here. You seem to.
That's great.
And you've been able to build your career to become successful here, which it's uncommon. I mean, isn't it? People tend to have to leave rather than. You grew up in New York. People tend to have to leave San Francisco, go to New York, and then complain that they aren't in San Francisco because New York made them, especially in theater, they kind of resent having to go anyplace else. But going the other direction, tell me about how that happened.
Well, I do travel, and travel as much as I can. And anyone who's listening who wants to book me in theaters, I love touring and traveling. I had a few friends, but one friend in particular named Scott Rosenberg, who's now editor of Grist.com, but he was at the time the theater critic of the San Francisco Examiner. This is, 20-some years ago, who invited me. We'd worked together in Boston at a newspaper, and he invited me here, and I came here and loved the Bay Area. But also he would send me reviews of various things he was seeing, theater things. I thought, wow, what a cool theater scene also as well in San Francisco. And when I came here, I was fortunate to come here at a time shortly after that, when it was around the time that solo performing was sort of happening. There was also stand-up comedy, a lot of stand-up comedy here. But there was also solo people trying to do this sort of thing, solo performing, in my case at least, totally inspired by Spalding Gray. And so one thing that I found is that I could develop my stuff. There was a community that was really interested in seeing stuff in process here. Not to say that there isn't such a community elsewhere, but it was here. And so I was able to do all of if I want to, all of the development of my shows here, if I want to. And the other thing is there are a number of theaters, a number of places that I can go to perform, in the extended Bay Area. It honestly would probably be, there are professional reasons why it would have been at least theoretically wise for me to move, at least for a certain amount of time, to New York and or LA. LA being more problematic in that I still don't know how to drive, but
I don't have a car in Los Angeles. It's fine.
Oh, really?
It's just the place is huge. It's not the transit. It's that you have to take solo. Yeah.
I remember though, I would be like, this is before I haven't been in LA in a long time, but I used to go, I had an agent and stuff like that for a while, and William Morris, and I would go to auditions and stuff, and this was before, I guess now cabs must have the thing in them, what is it? The thing that tells you how to get to someplace.
Oh, the GPS?
The GPS.
Yeah, you had the drivers getting lost?
Yeah, but to like an audition, like an audition. So I remember I was auditioning for, it was just horrible things, but some great things too. I didn't get any of them, but yeah, it would have made sense. Like it would be someone like me who's funny looking and can be funny. It would be a common thing to try to get into sitcoms as a performer, as a writer, as both. But I do love it here so much. But basically what happened is, my wife and I had a son. We have a son who's now, he'll be 15 in a couple of days from this interview. And we both felt very strongly that we wanted him to grow up here, in this area. Also, my wife teaches in a city in this area. She's a public school teacher and is very dedicated to her school and to her students and that community. And so basically it wasn't an option. It wasn't an option for me to move. But I do travel. I mean, and whenever I can get to New York, I can. It's so expensive to try to get to book in New York. Just to get like a little ad in the New York Times in the little theater boxes. Apparently thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. But I have, I do it periodically. I do it whenever I can, and I travel when I can, and I do enjoy it. But it's true that I'm based here. I'm not based in New York.
You are, to some extent, correct me if I'm wrong, but a Bay Area figure. I mean, when you did the television show, the Josh Kornbluth show, it was about, you being, if not rooted, then certainly an explorer of San Francisco and someone who was engaging in conversation with people who also had ties here, right?
In a way, I think that's true. That's absolutely true. And I think in a way, if I can make a very strange analogy, that's sort of in a way that Judaism for me is sort of like my current variant of communism. That the Bay Area for me is my current version of New York. Is just that New York was where I grew up, is where I'm from. But San Francisco and the Bay Area, we now live in Berkeley, has been really where I've become who I am as an adult. And it's now where I've lived the longest as well, just sort of chronologically. And that's something, and it's something that I hugely prize, is that I am part of the Bay Area, that I'm part of the culture. I was on the Energy Commission for a few years in Berkeley. I was on the Energy Commission, and I was really proud to do that. And yes, I feel it's weird because I had such a concept of myself as a New Yorker, and my parents were New Yorkers. They're, it's such a like New York Jew, New York, and
almost an overpowering culture to stay in, right?
Yeah, and I think I know so many, as I'm sure you do too, but like New Yorkers or East Coasterners, as I've heard them called, who come out to I think around here, maybe to other places as well in the Pacific Northwest or the West Coast. But when I think of specifically as coming to the Bay Area, we're like super tightly wound, and there's something just relaxing enough that we just slightly unwind enough so that we can function, so that we don't,
one notch.
Right, so that we're just one notch. So we go down from 11 to 10 or whatever, and we are actually able to somewhat function. And I know a lot of people like that, where it's like in Star Trek, like if you went to the planet, like you never were able to move on Earth, and you went to a planet when the gravity was just a little bit less. And you were, wow, now I'm LeBron.
What is it about? It's San Francisco to an extent. Berkeley is still an urban area. So are parts of the Pacific Northwest, but it's not like you guys are moving out to the wilderness to unwind. But I guess I think
it's important too, right? Yeah. It's important. It's not to unwind to zero.
Yes, don't go down that far.
Yeah. That you don't want to, you don't want to get mellow.
It does seem to me that the San Francisco and Berkeley, they do have this sense of, maybe a sense of possibility that New York stopped having. I don't know when it stopped, but New York is very much in the present. Here, I don't know.
It's so interesting for me because, for my son, I think my son adores New York when we visit New York. And one of my brothers still lives in New York, and we go visit. And my wife, who grew up all over the country, but spent a lot of her teen years in upstate New York, she loves New York. New York City was this incredible place to go to for her, and still is. For me, because it just has, is with my very idiosyncratic sense of communism, but New York has, it is the primordial ooze from which I come.
You can't stay in the ooze, ultimately.
You can't stay in the ooze, and believe me, I've tried. You got to get out of the ooze. You got to try. But I feel like that's for me. I'm not sure that it would be that for someone else. Of course, there's so many people who go to New York and do incredible things. And New York is the place that, in a way, it's the environment. It's, of course, there's all these great people and these creative people and the stimulation and opportunity. And so it's an environment for many people to become who they are. I find it now somewhat overwhelming, because I've gotten really used to this scale, and it's sort of me. I mean, I grew up in tenements, and I never would have imagined I would live in a place as suburban as Berkeley. My mom still reacts to Berkeley like, what, this cow town, I mean, she likes it, but not really. It's like slow. It closes down at any point, and I really love so much about this place. I love so much about the theater community here and the cultural community here. I'm an avid sports fan here. And then just now, because my family has grown here, my son has grown up here, and my wife and I have made a home here with him, it's a blessed place for me.
And then there's a sense, I mean, maybe you've thought about this since you have a son turning 15, that San Francisco and its environs, they tend to, blessed or not, they tend to urge their high aspiring young people out, right? I mean, there's a sense like you got, I know you like it here. You got to go. Maybe come back later, but you got to go. I don't know if you sense that.
My brother Jake talks about that. He's the one with whom I make movies. Sam's the one who lives in New York, and just for completion's sake, my sister Amy is in London right now. But my brother Jake does talk about that there's sort of you sometimes get a vibe that you're supposed to sort of experiment here, but if you really thought you were all that in a bag of chips, that you would go somewhere else. Like, that.
Oh, if you were serious, you would go somewhere other than where you grew up, essentially, at the ooze.
And I will say that, I, for several years, developed my monologue stuff here. And then I got a gig in New York, my first gig in New York, at Second Stage Theater, off-Broadway, really lovely theater. And the fact that I was going to New York became in here, like the press here, which is wonderful, has been wonderful to me. But it was like, oh, okay, now he's real, Like,
and you were just like, what, the ooze?
Yeah. And right. And then by the same token, the woman who was one of the artistic directors of the Second Stage Theater said to the New York Times about me, she said, yeah, he just, we don't know where he came. He just dropped from the sky about me. It's because, like, how could someone have come from outside of New York and have anything to say, I mean, sort of, I'm, paraphrasing and exaggerating, but yeah, and there is that feeling. And, when we made Haiku Tunnel and we, my brother and I, and we got into Sundance and got distributed a bit, there was also a thing, oh, that must be real too. I think, I don't know if it's specifically a Bay Area thing of sort of like, well, if you're so great, then why are you still here?
I don't want to say the stereotype is true, but I guess the theater scene is a bit insular over there in New York, right?
I don't really know it well enough to make overarching statements about it. Theater and insular seem to go together well, theater and ego, insular.
But it seems like, in your own work, when you're doing it in theaters, the intent seems to be to get beyond the insular. You talk about talking about your own life, but it connects. You connect it to the rest of the world. It seems like and on as many points as possible. I mean, there's a sense that I get from your monologues that this may be in a small space. It may be one man talking, but get it connected to everything else, and suddenly those qualities don't make it so insular anymore. That was a little complicated question, but does it make sense so far?
It does. It does to me, which is a bad sign for you, I think. That seemed totally cogent to me.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
As for the listeners, well, they'll have to fight through it.
Yes, absolutely. Or listen, or whatever. By this point, I don't. But yeah, I feel this way when I go to the theater, and a little theater piece in a little theater and something that I love. I tend to feel like this is connected to the whole world. This is world important.
Right. World important. That's one thing, but it's the sense that your material is everything in there. I mean, there's really no limits for what your material ultimately is, right? There's your life to work from, but it doesn't stop anywhere. They start there.
It doesn't even stop with my life. I mean, it remains tethered to my life just because that seems to be how I begin to think of stories. But yeah, there are no limits at all. I mean, and whatever limits there are way beyond my capacity. Anyhow, so I don't need to worry about them.
And how do you keep that? How do you keep it from being daunting? You know, when you're taking on religious subjects now, or even taking on everything that playing the oboe can connect to. There's a sense in which, how do you keep it from being too much? You've got to hack a pathway through this, and you'll always do. But what can you say about how that happens?
But that is the great challenge, and it's also the great joy. I mean, where I am right now, I have almost a full year till this next theater piece, which, by the way, will have other people on stage with me. I'm possibly acting, but certainly musicians, maybe actors as well. I am in this point now where I'm like practicing my oboe, and I'm reading about music stuff, and I'm reading about philosophical things, and reading Jewish things, and rereading Exodus in different translations, and I'm doing all these things, and all the possibilities are endless. And yes, they have to find their way, and part of the joy and the magic and the challenge of it is finding that way, is in a really mysterious, I don't know if it's mystical properly, but very mysterious way to me, that it certainly feels like, from my perspective, that the piece is telling you what it needs to be at some point, that you're listening for what the piece should be. That may itself be some sort of weird mental construction that sort of tries to cover up the void,
Sure.
But it certainly feels that way, and it gives me so much sort of pleasure to strive for it, that it really just vastly overwhelms any possible terror. There is terror, but it's just, the terror is just, it just can't stand up to the joy. It just can't. Unlike in many other areas of my life, in which it's the reverse.
Yeah, it's becomes this, I think, fight for everybody. Would you say, to find the one or two things where the fear is still there, but it doesn't matter so much?
Yeah, I feel somehow that we're talking about sex. But
this is, everything connects to everything, yeah. I guess. I mean, ultimately, tell me if I'm wrong, but as a monologist, if you can connect something to sex, you might as well do it.
Yeah, well, sex is easy. That's like, it's sort of like for like Michael Jordan, if you gave him like a Nerf ball basketball that's like 2 feet above, like he doesn't need that.
Yes.
He can do everything that he needs to do, with a standard size 10 foot above the ground rim. Okay, so for me, I mean, to connect anything to sex is really pretty easy.
Doesn't impress people?
It doesn't impress people, at least after a certain point, unless you do it in a particularly interesting way. So I guess what I'm saying is, but to connect, communism and calculus, now that's something I've done that people didn't expect, at least not right away.
Right.
So.
To connect oboe-playing and
oboe-playing, to connect the practice of Judaism and the practice of the oboe.
Both practices.
Both of them, when I practice them, tend to irritate people who are nearby. And that is literally what I've set for myself as the goal here, is to make that connection and to make it in as deep and interesting way as I can.
You have the islands, or the worlds, you need only to bridge them.
And there's such rich worlds to me, and I mean, not just to me, but they're so rich. I mean, the world of music, the world of religion, the world of Judaism, the world, and of not just oboes, but double reeds, which go back, many, many centuries. And there's so many ways that things can be connected. And then to find a way that makes for a contained narrative, for an entertaining piece, that can be moving to people. It's just a really great job to try to do that.
The final thing I wonder about that is, there also Judaism and playing any kind of instrument, I mean, music, these are both important elements of the culture that people from outside of them, people who aren't Jewish or are not schooled in Judaism or Jewish tradition, people who appreciate music but can't read a score, don't know how to play an instrument, they'll read a Jewish novel, they'll watch a Jewish comedian, or they'll listen to any kind of music, and they'll say, boy, I'm really enjoying these things. I feel like I would be enjoying them so much more if I understood them, but they seem so complicated. Judaism, music, that seems like, I don't know, I sense that as a widespread feeling among people for those, specifically those categories, like, this is great. If only I knew a damn thing about them.
Right. I would say, again, not to speak, it's hard for me even to speak for one person, myself as a Jew, but not speak for all Jews. But my sense of the sort of the Jewish approach would be, this is just incredibly complicated. How wonderful. I can't possibly know all this. No one could figure it all out. How great. It's to be able, it's in a way, it's to be given a kinder gym. Yes, I used to bring my son to the kinder gym at the Y. It's a play area with infinite amounts to playing where you'll never exhaust the number of things you can do and never exhaust yourself or exhaust your possibilities. I do also think, by the way, one thing that resonates to me with what you said, and it's something I've been reliving as I picked up the oboe again after many years of not playing it, is I actually feel there's something in what you said that there's a kernel in it. I mean, there's more than that, but there's one thing that particularly resonated that you talked about, which is the idea of entering the world yourself, of trying to do it yourself, to be inside it, being a different experience from being outside of it. In my case, to practice or try to practice Judaism in my own sort of atheistic way, but seriously to practice it, is something that it's a great adventure for me and brings an enormous amount of depth that I had not experienced before I entered it. Similarly, and I don't find this way, I listen to lots of rock and roll, lots of folk music, stuff, some jazz, but I find that with classical and with jazz, I haven't played jazz, my son does, but with classical music, that when I play something, I can really appreciate it. When I played second oboe in Stravinsky's The Firebird, and it was gorgeous, and I have all these oboe pieces, and the oboe repertoire is really limited, but what I found is that by playing, because it's such complicated music in a way, that I would learn and feel what it felt like to live inside the music, and I don't almost ever get that same sort of enjoyment from outside. So just in something you said that sort of made me particularly think about that in both of these cases, you look at things in a way, like I would say, it's easy for a Jew to make a Jewish joke. It also can be in a way a crutch. It can be a way of it can become a way of sort of being superficial, which is to say, I'm Jewish, and then there are these like sort of tropes about being Jewish, right? And then
jokes about locks and whatnot.
Locks are about shrugging, or about being ambivalent, or I guess about money stuff, although I've never experienced that myself. But those are things that people can say about themselves, and it can sort of be a technique to disarm an audience and say, don't be afraid of me, whatever. But there's another way in which sort of doing that, at least in my generation, is just doing it to a certain level is sort of almost like taking what people like Woody Allen did and created this character that then was very new in American culture, in popular culture, of taking certain Jewish urban characteristics, the schlemiel. But in a way, it's just sort of putting on the coat that they already made, that they already designed. Whereas for me, what is so exciting is that to actually go inside the study of it, first of all tells me sometimes where these tropes came from, but also I feel like I'm being myself more, like I'm exploring what I come from rather than kind of approximating what I come from or approximating what I am. I don't know. It has to do with practice. It has to do with And I've certainly felt that way in the theater. The theater has given me this opportunity through doing it so much with all these wonderful people of learning a craft, which I'm continuing to learn, and of practicing and of doing stuff over and over and failing and failing and failing and failing and occasionally having a little success and failing and failing. It's just such a wonderful privilege to be able to practice something that is rich and complex. So being inside the thing, it's an active thing. And I think theater sort of in a way feels to me, I love movies, I love TV, love all these things, but theater feels like an active thing to me. My relationship with an audience is a relationship of living people who are living in that moment. And it involves a certain amount of work, on both sides. The audience has to visualize their version of what I'm trying to describe for my life. They have to complete the story. Because all they're looking at is a bald, sweating guy, which I'm not saying isn't fun, but there's, everything beyond that they have to do. So anyhow, I'm glad that there's still practitioners.
I've been speaking at the Contemporary Jewish Museum in downtown San Francisco with monologist Josh Kornbluth. And, I could list off all the monologues again. I'll link to all of them, of course, all I can find about all of them in the show notes. But you'll want to be watching for the next one, as you can tell. And the title is locked down on that?
I often start with the title and then just fit the piece to the title. This one will be called Sea of Reeds.
Sea of Reeds.
It'll open in Berkeley at the Ashby Stage Theater, scheduled for next July of 2013.
You have your notice, listeners. Josh, thanks so much for taking the time today.
Thank you, Colin. It's been a pleasure.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with all of the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. And special thanks to everyone who backed this season on Kickstarter: Danny Bolson, Brad and Laramie on movies, Paul Doyle, Umberto Grant, Matt Howie, Andrew Hovanek, Mark Hines, Mary Gillander, Eric Graham, Will Graham, John French, Andrew Philippon Jr., Kimberly Hahn, Chris Kay, Andy Cooney, Mark Larson, Rebecca O'Malley, Michael O'Regan, Gail Poole, Blake Riley, Superfan Giovanni, Aidan Nullman, Adam Schaefer, Rob Schultz, Scott Schenker, Cam Smith, Kevin Smokler, Adam Sutherland, TSD, Thomas Unterberger, Matt Warren, and Wayne Wright.